start, let me explain myself. I'm 5'7", 113 pounds, and I was 16 at the time of the encounter. I'm a multi-sport athlete. Track, handball, volleyball, basketball, and hockey. And I have insomnia. This all happened around 2 a.m. on August 10th of 2019. I had been over to my best friend's place because she had just returned home from a vacation, and she had birthday presents for me. Hoodies and gummies if you're curious. I had spent almost an hour there already, and wanted to head back home soon because, honestly, my town is scary at night. And drug dealers and a lot of really bad people. You know the deal. So I waved goodbye to my best friend and started walking down her street. I guess a party had just let up because behind me at the end of the road, about 20 or 30 yards from where I was standing, there were a couple of men walking across the crosswalk. They were both pretty tall. I'm guessing between 5'11" and 6'3". The two seemed harmless at first when I looked in their direction, but soon they came to a stop. They were both looking at me. At this point I felt uncomfortable, so I just kept walking, and that's when I overheard what one of them had said. "Hey, that's a girl." At this, I whipped my head around. They were starting to walk in my direction now, and one of the two men had moved over towards the sidewalk where there was no light. I knew at this point that something wasn't right, and I began to pick up my pace. They were still getting closer. I didn't know where the second guy was, but when I looked back, the first guy was still following me down the middle of the road. I think that they were planning to cut me off and try to trap me between the two of them. The minute I was about 13 yards from the T intersection, I started to run, and that's when the yelling had started. "Oh great, now she's running." I hooked a sharp right and then a left. I could still hear them behind me, and at this point all I knew was that I could not stop moving. I had to lose them somehow. I was coming up to an apartment building with a small parking lot behind it. There were no lights. I made the split-second decision to veer off into the parking lot, and I squeezed myself under one of the cars. I don't know how long that I waited there. It could have been a minute, but it felt like a lifetime. I watched the two men run past. They didn't bother to check under the cars, which was definitely in my favor. The minute that I felt that I was safe, I backtracked and took a different route back to my home. I was too scared to take the main way, in the fear that I would have bumped into them. I know what I'm about to say is stupid, but I didn't go to the police. I wouldn't have been able to give a proper description of the men, because I hadn't seen their faces. If there is anything I learned from my experience, it's that no matter who you are, you need to be extremely careful. You can think that the part of town or city that you live in is safe, but that really isn't the case. There is no protective barrier to keep out people with bad intentions. Please, whatever you do, watch your surroundings as if your life depends on it. If I had been listening to my music and not paying attention, I hate to think what could have happened to me. I hope that no one else has to experience the fear that I did. It was almost like prey being chased by predators. Back in 2015, when I was in my second semester of college as a freshman, I had a habit of pacing around to keep my thoughts coming. I had had this habit since childhood, and it often seemed that I couldn't stay focused on anything that required creative thought without it. Considering my intended major required literature and creative writing courses, it was something that I found myself doing constantly, especially when I was trying to think up ideas for essays and narratives assigned in class. To be clear, my pacing just isn't walking. It needs to be done along a predictable short route, so I can mentally clock out of reality and focus solely on my thoughts while I run on autopilot. I often put in headphones to prevent distractions that take me back into reality, because if that happens in mid-thought pattern, I'll lose at least half of the ideas that I was exploring. It's weird, I know, but I wanted to clarify this now because I've had people ask me why I just don't go for a long walk around the neighborhood, instead of walking around in circles in my backyard like I normally do. It was getting late one evening, and I had a lengthy essay due the day after next. I had a good portion of it done already, but I still had a bit to go. My roommate had come back to the dorm, and considering the time it was, perfectly understandable that she wanted to sleep. She generally didn't mind my pacing, but preferred that I didn't do it when she was trying to rest. It's also understandable. And with her turning the lights off in the room, it would be a little difficult for me anyway. I still wanted to keep going on this assignment though, so I decided to find somewhere else on campus outside the room to pace, and figured I would note down ideas in an app on my phone as needed for later. There was nowhere in the dorm complex that was suitable, so I started walking around. The university was well known for its large campus, so I figured I would find a good place eventually. I walked for a bit until I found myself at one of the more historic buildings, which had a nice courtyard in front of it. Part of this courtyard included wide pedestrian paths that met in the center, as a nice roundabout with a fountain in the middle. A little further from that was another small roundabout with a grass island in the center. Circular paths like that are ideal for my pacing, because I don't have to stop and turn around repeatedly, and I ended up choosing to walk around the one with the grass island, so I wouldn't disturb anyone who wanted to hang out by the fountain. Some people are a bit unnerved by my pacing, so I worried it might freak out a stranger who saw me on a late-night walk. There was the occasional passerby, but for the most part, the place was empty at this time of night. I figured I could go in circles for a bit without disturbing anyone. I put in my headphones. Yes, both of them, and yes, I'm aware that was a poor decision, given these circumstances, but I was exhausted, and I just wanted to get the brainstorming session over with so I could go to sleep. I started to walk in circles with my music playing as my mind drifted. I don't know how long I was pacing before the encounter, but it wasn't long. As I was rounding once more, I was met by headlights from a car driving slowly up the path to this roundabout. I was a little confused by this, as I was sure the path was meant for pedestrian traffic only. But since it was deserted save for me, I just assumed that the driver needed an easy way to turn around, and didn't think it was a big deal since the risk of accidentally hitting someone was next to zero. The vehicle passed me while I moved closer to the center to keep me from being in the way, and I kept my eyes on it while I walked. I expected the car to just go around and back down the path that it came from, since that was the only path on the roundabout that led back to the street. But instead, it came to a stop on the side of the roundabout opposite the street. While I initially started to assume then that they needed to look at their GPS or make a phone call before continuing, there was no denying the uneasy feeling I got about the situation. Instead of continuing my round route, which would have taken me right alongside the vehicle, I decided to take one of the paths toward the building and just wait for them to move on. While I walked, I noticed an empty parking lot on the other side of the building. The path didn't go there, but it was easy to walk over the grass patch dividing the two areas. I started to pace in the lot for a bit, and I quickly forgot about returning to the roundabout, as I got lost in my thoughts again. I was pulled back into reality by the shine of semi-distant headlights. It was the same car from before, or at least it looked eerily similar. Luckily, I was facing the entrance to the lot as it turned in, and said entrance was a decent distance from me. I started to hear quiet alarm bells in the back of my mind, even as my rational side tried to assume that it must be a different car, and just an odd coincidence. And perhaps I was just paranoid. Regardless of the mental attempt to explain it away, I felt it was better safe than sorry. I ended up walking around the other side of the building to get back to the little roundabout that I was at before. I took a breath and I calmed my nerves a little with some half-hearted reassurances before walking on the roundabout again. This time, I didn't turn my music back on, but I kept my headphones in. They weren't noise canceling at all, so I could hear decently through them when the music was paused. I wanted to go back to brainstorming, but felt somewhat anxious and panicky at the thought of it. So I kept pacing like I had been, this time focused on the very much aware of what was going on around me. I thought that maybe once 10 or 15 minutes had gone by without incident, I'd be able to calm down and get the last of this done. Barely 5 minutes had passed when I heard the obvious sound of rubber tires coming up the path again. This time when I looked, I was certain it was the same car and that it had followed me back here from the parking lot. I didn't know what the driver wanted with me. They never honked, rolled down windows, or anything to try and get my attention. But I realized at that point that as a 19-year-old girl alone at night in a more secluded area of campus, I had been extremely lucky so far. And that luck wouldn't last forever. This time, I speed-walked through the grass. There's a pedestrian-only arch-like bridge that goes over a busy major street that runs through campus. Most of the dorms like mine are on one side of the bridge, while lecture halls and class buildings are on the other. And while I normally hated this bridge because of how steep it was closer than the nearest street crossing right then. I didn't have a wait time to cross it, and there was no chance of a vehicle following me up. I felt much more at ease from the top of it, and from there I saw the car drive off, seemingly calling it a night. I walked back to my dorm, and by the time I reached my door, the adrenaline had worn off and I was exhausted. I went in quietly to not wake my roommate, laid in bed without even changing into pajamas, and I fell asleep. I never contacted campus police about the matter or anything, because I didn't have any helpful information, other than a four-door car that could have been black or dark blue for all I know, and it didn't seem like I'd be believed anyway. I never saw the vehicle again or heard anything that related to it in any way, so over time, it slipped my mind altogether. I still don't know what the driver had planned, or why they didn't just get out of the car and come after me on foot at any point. Maybe it was the first time that they were trying this, and they were nervous about making a scene or getting caught. Maybe it was just some college assholes messing with me, because they thought it was fun to scare people like that. Whatever it was, I'm glad I didn't have to find out the hard way, and I never paced in public areas after dark on that campus again. At the age of 12, I started babysitting for family friends who had 3 daughters, ages 4 to 7. They lived in a cul-de-sac where nearly every home housed a young couple, with children in the local elementary school. The neighborhood was extremely close-knit, like the 1950s American block party communities. They had a communal policy on using one another's toys. Any kid could use a play structure in someone else's yard anytime without asking. Shortly after, I started working in the neighborhood. They revised the rule to anytime a family is not using a babysitter to watch their kids, to ensure that I would not get overwhelmed supervising a swarm of kids I wasn't paid to watch. It was thus more or less known when parents were going out and leaving someone else in charge of their children. I was welcome to take the girls to play in any other yard as they wanted. Their parents even gave me permission to let them play in someone else's yard or a sandbox independently if I needed a short break. Being an avid Babysitters Club reader, I didn't leave the girls outside unsupervised ever. I would wait until someone else wanted a water or a bathroom break, and then corral everyone inside temporarily. Similarly, when the girls wanted to play in the treehouse owned by an older couple a few doors up the street, I climbed up despite a slight fear of heights and crouched in the little house with them, despite feelings of claustrophobia to follow my own rule. I don't recall whether my everyone inside, everyone outside together rule preceded the first odd interaction I had with the immediate next-door neighbor or not. But when the police questioned the girls that I babysat years later, they said nothing bad ever happened when I watched them, because I had set up that weird, sometimes annoying rule. One day while playing basketball with the girls in the driveway, The next-door neighbor came outside in a baseball cap and sunglasses and sat down on his second-story deck to read a paperback. I later noticed that he had turned his chair around 180 degrees to face us and the basketball hoop. I couldn't tell if he was looking at us. He had no reaction to me staring at him, flipping pages in the book like someone when they're reading. This behavior repeated every time he played basketball for the 5 years that I watched the girls. Eventually, once I had noticed him in the chair, accessories on, I would suggest a game we could play inside or in the front yard, but out of view. The strange neighbor was familiar to me as he went to my local church. I have never seen someone kneel in a pew, head bowed and hands folded, with the same level of intensity before or since. Once when my family was seated behind him, the priest came over to ask me to lead the children's mass during the homily because the usual person was out sick. This guy turned around and glared at me like I personally set out to interrupt his prayer time. When I worked in the church's nursery during various masses, I would often make eye contact with him as he waited in line outside the nursery door to use the restroom. From what I gleaned from our family friends and other people in the neighborhood, the odd basketball observer was a nice guy who gave up his apartment and job in the city to move in with and care for his sick, elderly mother. Since everyone thought he was so great, and since he went to church, this was before the Catholic sex scandal had broke out, I figured I was in the wrong for finding him creepy. Even as a young 12-year-old, I was used to guys in their 40s and 50s asking me to go somewhere with them, or driving by slowly as I walked, bite, jog to make lewd comments. I figured I was projecting those experiences onto this awkward, quiet guy who wasn't doing anything wrong. For instance, I was certain that if the guy next door was a creep, he would not miss the opportunity to watch with his sunglasses on and book in hand while the kids and I went swimming each summer when the family opened their above-ground pool. But he never set foot out on his deck when the kids and I donned swimsuits to play in the pool or the backyard. I was more convinced I was conceited and mean. That's when I was 15 or 16. I caught him looking in the window as I cleaned up after movie night. The girls and I had put on a film after bath time, and instead of watching it theater style in total darkness, we kept some lights on so I could braid the girls' hair. The big screen TV we used for movies was located in an addition on the house with floor-to-ceiling windows. Though my parents were OCD about shutting blinds and curtains when the sun went down to prevent people from seeing in, our family friends had no window treatments on the big, modern windows. When I turned off the last light in the room, a floor lamp right next to a window facing the neighbor's house, I could see into the darkness outside where that weird man sat on his deck in a chair, in line with the window I was looking through. I looked over my shoulder and realized that he had a line of sight on where the girls and I sat on the floor during the movie. As I looked back towards the house, I glimpsed him hustling inside. I would have doubted I would see him at all if he had not left the chair in an unusual spot. After watching him turn the chair around to read during many a basketball match, I knew where the chair sat that night, facing the window into the family room. It was not the chair's usual position on the deck. After that incident, I would suggest playing board games in another room, or insist on watching movies theater style to ensure that he could not peep on what we did at night. Once the girls were asleep, I avoided the family room entirely because I was paranoid about being watched. If I wasn't in the kitchen doing homework or reading, away from all windows, I would walk around the original first-floor footprint of the house, where all the windows had curtains. The first time the parents noticed my change in routine, they insisted I could watch TV or movies in the family room. I didn't mention anything to them because I was worried my concerns were silly and conceited. When I was 17, my family heard an evening cable news story about a man in our town caught in a police sting operation, in which a woman pretended to offer up her 2-year-old. When they raided his house, the police found a ton of horrible things on his computer. Our family friends called a couple of weeks later. They wanted to know how I knew the young man next door to them was not safe. He was the guy that I had heard about on TV. As they described it, the police found his blog where he wrote about his obsession with one of the girls who lived next door to him. It detailed his fantasies involving her and his plans to act on them. Things like lying in the treehouse for hours, hoping to corner her when she climbed up alone to play. Many of his entries focused on taking advantage of or kidnapping the girl, while the babysitter was in charge. In his head, babysitters were like the ones in old movies, talking to friends on the phone or making out with a boy they invited over, instead of caring for the children. As it became clear that I did neither of those things, his plans evolved to killing the babysitter, taking the girl, and getting out of Dodge. After talking to the girls to ensure that they were not victims, the police suggested that I might know something to have acted the way that I did. All the pieces, the frequent run-ins at church when I had children in my care, or the weird things that he did when he knew I was watching the kids next door, all fit together cohesively. I was relieved I was not mean-spirited or imagining things. I was perhaps conceited. The focus was not on me but on the children. But I was not crazy.